the police beating of Rodney King and the death of Trayvon Martin were a catalyst for artist Nick Cave to create dark and fanciful work. It's been featured in major exhibitions at Mass MoCA and the Peabody Essex Museum. Now, in what he calls a deflating time, he's shifted his focus to joy in a major new work at the Cyclorama at the Boston Center for the Arts. I recently spoke with Cave about how he'll spread that joy around Boston and how for him, happiness means inflatable lawn ornaments. Nick Cave, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this started with this question about joy. So tell me how you arrived at joy.
I arrived to this whole notion of joy really from my last solo exhibition in New York. My work has sort of always been based in looking at sort of gun violence. This last exhibition I was able to turn the chapter. And turning the chapter, I don't know, happiness was there.
Well, how does that become the next chapter when you're looking at gun violence?
It's really looking at that in terms of optimism and hope, which is what we need right now.
Well, so tell me and tell us what you've done at the Cyclorama.
As I was thinking about happiness, I was thinking, okay, what does this mean, or what do we think that means? And so it led me to the holidays and our intentions. And, we go in with great intentions and, it can become a catastrophe. But how do we still under those circumstances still find ways to hold things together in order to get through? And so then I started to think about the holiday lawn ornaments, blow-up inflatables, and proceeded to buy a few, cut them up, and started to sew them back together.
Well, more than a few.
Thousands. And so that was really this beginning of just how do we put it all back together? The the confusion, the conflict, this disarray, and try to make sense of it all.
And then as you walk through this installation, they move, they breathe. Where does movement come into it for you?
I was very interested also in this whole moment of deflation, being depleted, being just totally exhausted. But somehow what was interesting for me there was that at the same time we have to pick the pieces all up and keep going. I was interested in this whole idea of the last breath. And it's really interesting to see these enormous forms that are just expanding with just this vastness, and then all of a sudden it just becomes limp. And that was again, this emotional roller coaster that we are constantly living in right now.
Well, with Augment, you up the interaction here. And it's not just a passive experience a lot of people will have when you invite them to a parade that's going to happen. And even before that, I know you've been working with the community here in Boston. Mm-hmm. But what are you doing there in demanding something of people?
The second part of Augment also opens up and is premiering in Upham's, which is a wall work that is built on a series of collages that the community have created, which then were brought back to our studios in Chicago and were augmented even more. And so then the entire side of a bank that is going to be eventually torn down is completely embellished with their work. So it really creates these two bookends. And then in September, the inflatables will be processioned to the other destination.
What role do you see the artist has? And you've been an artist who's been working for a very long time. In these times, we've already talked about one major issue confronting this country around gun violence. What should artists be doing, or what do you think they need to be doing?
For me, I think about, I'm an artist with a civic responsibility, so, I try to do as much as I can do to provide comfort, to provide a space. I remember when Mass Mocha opened and Michael Brown had just happened. And so it was interesting for me because a number of people that work there, texted me and said, I just went into Until and just sat there. Because it was a place that they could go and feel safe and also just mourn around, these sort of senseless sort of violence acts. And so, for me, it's important that I sort of, how can I be of service and what can I do as a citizen to sort of also make a difference and be a part of change.
A lot of people will know you through your work of the sound suits, especially people locally who saw them at the Peabody Essex Museum. And those, I'll try to do justice to your work, but after the Rodney King riots, they were suits that you created to mask gender and identity. They were a protection. How do you see those suits more than 20 years later?
Well, it's interesting because I remember when the incident with Trayvon Martin, and I sort of created a new work that's TM13. I'm just sort of fortunate to have this sort of avenue, this sort of venue to sort of pour all my emotions into. So it's not, sometimes I wish there was other things that I could sort of talk about within my work, but yet I can't. And that's okay, because I'm able to still sort of, it's a balance act. It's, it's catastrophe, and it's sort of, at the same time, I have to have sort of optimism, hope, happiness, joy. And so, all of that just sort of comes together like this. And everything is poured into the making of something, amazing. But in times of trauma, there's also sort of something that's sort of born.
Is it your natural inclination to find that's what's born, or to find the joy, or is it a struggle to find the joy?
I don't know if I think about it in terms of struggle. It's just sort of part of the operation. It's the fuel that feeds my work. The conflict is what feeds me in order to produce what I do.
Is that the same need or urge that you've had ever since you were a child?
I think so. I remember when I was a kid, and there was a family that my mother would always cook more food, and we would, I have 6 brothers, and so we would take it down to this family. And so we just, that sort of empathy that, was so sort of part of sort of my DNA. And so, I think it really sort of started there. This sort of sense of care and help. And
you knew that you had to do this. There wasn't any other path.
Oh, no, absolutely. It's, I think for me, it's that, I'm a messenger first, artist second. And so, and with that being said, it allows me to sort of come at my practice in a much more liberating way.
Well, Nick Cave, thank you so much for bringing joy to the city. Much needed. much needed.
Great. Thank you for having me.